Thank you so much, Alistair, for that lovely introduction. As Alistair says, I am indeed visiting from the US, but if you detect an accent, it's because I'm from Sydney originally. You won't hold that against me. I was a counsellor of your sister chapter in the ROCS, AIAA, New South Wales, many years ago. So it's very nice to be, if not quite back on home turf, then on very familiar turf. It's also lovely to see a number of old friends here, who I hope are going to remain studiously quiet throughout and save their questions for later. Actually, the oldest friend here is the Honourable David Harper, good friend of my parents. Wonderful to have you here, David. I think I've seen you since you saw me in diapers, but I suspect you may have been at my baptism many years ago, which is a bit terrifying to think about. Hopefully I've learned something since then. I guess we're about to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1999, Jim Woolsey, who was the CIA, previously the CIA director, appeared before the Banking Committee of the United States House of Representatives, and he told them a little story which I think is a very useful way into this discussion. He said that if you were on the shores of Lake Geneva, say at the restaurant of one of the hotels there, and you came across a gentleman in a $3,000 suit and a pair of Gucci loafers, and he said to you that he was a representative of a Russian trading company, an import-export company, and he had a proposition for you about a joint venture, then there were four possibilities. The first possibility was that he was exactly that. He was a Russian trading company executive. The second possibility was that he was in fact a Russian intelligence officer operating under commercial cover. The third possibility was that he was a representative of a Russian organized crime group. But the fourth possibility, he said the most interesting possibility was that in fact this gentleman was all of those things, and that all of those institutions were perfectly happy with the arrangement. More and more, as Alistair said, what we see around the world is a blurring of politics, organized crime, and legitimate business. And when we think through the implications of that for international affairs, they're rather daunting. How, as a state actor, are you to know if the interlocutor you're dealing with is really representing the state that they say they represent, or whether they're representing some hidden nefarious interest? How are you to know whether you can trust their word or whether there's some hidden power operating behind them? How can we build a system of liberal institutionalism? How can we have treaties if reciprocity is undermined by these hidden interests? Now, you might say it has ever been thus, but there is clearly something going on when you have very serious allegations that a regime like the North Korean regime is allegedly involved in not only drug trafficking, but human trafficking and counterfeiting of foreign currency on a massive scale. In West Africa, we have very credible evidence that elements of militaries, in particular in Guinea-Bissau, have been turned over almost wholesale to criminal interests, to traffic drugs through West Africa, from Latin America through West Africa into Europe. In other places, we see a convergence of criminal and political influence in banking systems. All of this raises very serious questions about how international affairs are going to operate in the future. So this book that I had the pleasure of writing over the last few years tries to wrestle with this question of the intersection of politics and organised crime, where one ends and the other starts. And indeed, Alistair, you very nicely and presciently stole my punchline. For those of you at the back, I'm not sure if you can see that, there's a little boy, he's saying, "Dad, I'm considering a career in organised crime," and the guy looks up and said, "Government or private sector?" The reason this is amusing is precisely because it gets to a truth that is not the conventional truth. The conventional truth is politics in one corner, organised crime in the other, never the twain shall meet. Upper world up there, underworld down there. Maybe they meet in the bar every now and then, but there's no meaningful strategic interaction. And This book tries to address this question at two levels, conceptual and theoretical, and empirical. The conceptual and theoretical is much less fun, so I'm going to cover that in just a couple of minutes, and then we'll come on to the fun empirical stuff. At the conceptual level, the question is, are these things really that different? The historical answer from theorists, in particular from the political science field, has been, yes, absolutely, they're completely different. Political actors are motivated by the pursuit of power. Criminal actors are motivated by the pursuit of profit. They're completely separate things. Interestingly, criminologists, on the other hand, have had a somewhat different answer. They've said, well, actually, in some cases, we see that some criminal groups seem to develop a sort of quasi-governmental role within illicit markets, governing those markets, providing alternative dispute resolution regimes, because you can't go to the court when you've got a dispute over a criminal contract, providing enforcement. But they haven't followed that thought through. They've recognised that there's something governmental about these groups, but they haven't then thought what that means, not just at the domestic level, but at the international level. What if you had groups who took that governmental power and used it on the international stage? What would that look like? Would that look like Dr. No in James Bond, or would it look like something else? And when we see that there are groups, for example in Mexico, who are quite deliberately cultivating influence in neighbouring countries, such as Guatemala, is that what we're talking about? We don't really have a theoretical framework for understanding this. And yet, when you talk to criminals, they understand this. This is a guy called Francisco Anaya. He was a very important figure in Italy in the early 90s because he was the first major state's witness from inside the mafia who told the story of how it really operated. And he told that story to the famous and very brave magistrate Giovanni Falcone, who was later blown up. And Manoia had this to say when he was asked about it. He said that it's often believed that people work with the Cosa Nostra for the money, but that's only partly true, he said. Do you know why I became a mafioso? Because before, I had been a nobody in Palermo, and then afterwards, wherever I went, heads bowed. You can't value that in money, he said. So he was saying, yes, of course it's about money, but it's about much more than money. And when you read through the mafia accounts, the first-hand accounts told in judicial fora, they're all very clear. This is about power, it's about authority, it's about ascending to the aristocracy in the underworld. So for them, this separation between profit and power is nowhere near as clear as it is for the political scientists sitting in their ivory tower. But equally, what we see is that increasingly there is this blurring of the upper world and the underworld. And the argument that I advance in the book, got my little postcard here, thank you, Hauser, is that in fact in some places, in certain circumstances, criminal and political actors are operating in a single market for government. And what I mean by that is that we are all consumers of governmental systems, of governmental norms and regimes. Most of us think that the governments we have to deal with are the Melbourne Council or the Victorian government or the federal government, Commonwealth government. We don't really think about the possibility of being governed by some other force or system. But that's not necessarily the case around the world. In Mexico, you're as much governed by the Zetas or by the Sinaloa cartel as you are by the Mexican government, if not more. In Guatemala, you're probably more governed, if you're a young man, by the maras and by their norms, the gangs, transnational gangs, than you are by the formal government. And we see this increasingly in different places around the world, that where the formal governmental system is weak, alternative governmental arrangements emerge. And criminal actors, I argue, are one form of alternative governmental arrangement. Now, we learn from the business literature that when you have a competitive market, firms can position themselves in a number of different ways. And what I argue in the book, and this is where we get to come to the fun stuff, the empirical stuff, is that if we look at the historical record, there are at least 6 ideal type strategies that criminal organisations use to position themselves in the market for government. What's common to all of them is that in all cases, criminal actors don't want to be the state. In fact, they reject being the state. What is peculiar about criminal strategy is that you want your power to remain more or less hidden, sometimes less, but often more hidden. The norms that you are espousing as a criminal actor are private, hidden norms. They're the code of omerta that guides the mafia and similar codes in other organisations around the world. But that said, what is different between these strategies is the relationship between the criminal actor and the political actor, the state or the political party. In some cases, they share jurisdiction, so they operate in the same place, but one has control of the upper world, one of the underworld. In other cases, they divide the territorial jurisdiction. You can have the capital, I'll have the hinterland, and so on. So what I'd like to do in the time that's left, the little time that's left, is run through some stories and show you from these stories what we can see about these different strategies. So I'm going to begin in 1941 in my now hometown, New York. In early 1941, this boat, which was the biggest cruise liner of its day, the Nanny, had just been seized by the US government after the US government entered the war, because France by then was an enemy power. And 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, this happened to the Normandy. That's at a pier just at the end of 42nd Street, just near where I used to live, in fact. There was a fire, she capsized, she was being refitted as a troop transport, the biggest troop transport. She could have taken 10,000 troops over to the European front. Around the same time, U-boats are wreaking havoc in the North Atlantic. A huge tonnage of merchant shipping was going down. And what this all led to was a panic, frankly, a panic in the population and a panic in the intelligence services that maybe, just maybe, Italian-American and German-American communities were forming a fifth column. That this was sabotage, that there was a risk that they were aligning themselves with the fascist powers, and that maybe America would be knocked out of the war before she even really entered. So the US Navy intelligence, who have control of New York Harbor, send down agents to the docks and start asking questions, and they are met with absolute stony silence. Because it turns out the US government doesn't control the docks around New York Harbor, the mafia does. So they set up a meeting. Now, everything that I tell you is not just hearsay. It comes from archives that I studied that have never been published in the University of Rochester. There were archives of a guy called Tom Dewey. You may have heard of him. He was a Republican figure, a district attorney, and later a governor and presidential candidate. You might have seen the famous, I can't remember which newspaper it was, but there's a very famous newspaper that says Dewey beats Truman. Their printing deadline was just a little bit early, it turned out. It turned out by the next morning it was the other way around. So at the end of the war, Dewey was asked as governor to look into the events that I'm about to describe. And he commissioned a judge, Judge Hurlins, who was clearly of impeccable scrutiny, to run a judicial inquiry. And for reasons that will become clear, those records were never released, but they're now public in a library archive, but never really studied in upstate New York. And you have in those records the testimony of 54 mafiosi and many judicial officers and many intelligence officers that make very clear that what I'm about to tell you is unquestionably the case. The US Naval Intelligence went to the district attorney and said, okay, we've got a problem, we can't get the intel we need on the docks, let alone the fishing vessels off the coast. Who do we talk to? And they said, you talk to this guy, Meyer Lansky. He was a Jewish gangster from the Lower East Side who grew up down there with this guy, Lucky Luciano, who you may have heard of. Dodgy looking character if ever there was one. And at that point, 1941, Lucky Luciano was sitting in jail up near the Canadian border because he'd been put there by Who? Tom Dewey, back when Tom Dewey was the district attorney. And so they did a deal. And they formed an alliance with the mafia, and the US Navy, the district attorney and the mafia, not only policed the docks for the rest of the war, but they got naval intelligence assets onto the shipping all up and down the East Coast. And that bit was known. What wasn't known, and my research revealed, was they did a number of other, rather, to use the same word again, dodgy things. They beat up labour activists, including a very famous Australian, Melburnian labour activist who was over there agitating at the time. The mafia trained the intelligence assets in illegal entry, in burglary, and they went into foreign consulates, breaking their privileges and seized information. They rounded up a number of suspected fascist sympathisers, and in the pièce de résistance, the mafia helped the naval intelligence guys find and arrest 4 Nazi saboteurs that had come for their summer holidays and landed in the Hamptons on the eastern end of Long Island. And that's actually the seizure of those saboteurs is what led to the famous Quirin case in the Supreme Court that is the legal basis for the military commissions in Guantanamo to this day. So what we see here is an effort by the United States of America to use the governmental power of the mafia to reach into a space, the docks and those communities that otherwise couldn't have. Now, all very interesting, you might say, but that's a purely domestic example, no real implications for international affairs. Well, it turned out that the Underworld Project, as it was called by US Naval Intelligence, did not end there. In fact, it continued into the planning of the invasion of Sicily. And just jumping over Tom Dewey, Lucky Luciano had had a long-standing feud with another faction in the New York Mafia who all came from this tiny little town on the northwest coast of Sicily. So when he was asked by Naval Intelligence where the Allies should have their amphibious assault on Sicily, this was his suggestion. Fortunately, they got a lot of evidence from other Sicilians and figured out that might not be the best place to land. They also rejected his offer, which was actually even taken to naval leadership in Washington, that he be parachuted in himself into Sicily and help with making contact with local mafiosi. But they did take up that idea, and they used mafia contacts to make contact with their Italian cousins and even a guy who'd escaped the electric chair in New York for a murder he committed. And on arriving, these same naval intelligence assets who'd worked in New York were shipped over as the vanguard of the invading force and carried out a number of joint operations with the mafia in Italy. So this is again an example of using an organised criminal group to extend your power on the international stage to reach places and have governmental influence that you wouldn't otherwise have. And it's an example, all of this, of what I describe in the book as intermediation strategy by a mafia, coming between the state and markets or communities that the state is having trouble reaching and brokering between them and extracting rents from that brokering pattern. Now, what happened in Sicily as a result brings us to the second strategy, the second positioning strategy, which I describe as a strategy of autonomy. This is when a mafia says to a state, you have that part of the market over there, and we'll have this part of the market. And in fact, we're going to maintain separation from your governmental power. When they arrived, the Allies realized that the mafia was the real governmental power on the island now that the fascist forces had collapsed. And the question was what to do about them. In 2 memos that I found buried in the British National Archives, a very insightful former American diplomat who'd been brought into American intelligence wrote 2 incredibly clear memos saying to the leadership of the Allied military government, you have 3 choices. You can confront the mafia. However, we have about 4 police in the mission, and if we arrest 500 or 600 people, which is what I think it would take, and inter them in offshore islands, the legitimacy of the operation might decline somewhat. So, not sure about that option. Second option, you could withdraw from parts of the island and just leave it to the mafia. Not sure what signal that would send to, say, Soviet Russia. Third option, you can reach an accommodation with the mafia. You can negotiate. Now, this memo is very instructive because when the organisation I work for, the United Nations, sends peacekeeping missions into countries today, and there are local criminal groups that have this kind of power, those are the same options that we confront today. They're all bad options, clearly. When Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States invaded Iraq 13 years ago, these were the same options that we had, all bad options. What happened was strategic indecision. The Allies didn't take a decision, and they left it to their local representatives to figure it out, to muddle through as they went along. Again, pretty much what we do in peace operations today. And in this little town, whose name you might recognise, the British guy the British agent, the local agent, tried to muddle through an accommodation with the local mafiosi, but he was quickly outsmarted. And what emerged as a result of the strategy adopted by the local Sicilian mafia was actually an insurgency pushing for Sicilian secession. Don't say that too quickly after a glass of wine. The leaders of this secessionist movement, sponsored, we know, from the archives by mafiosi, wrote directly to Truman, wrote directly to Churchill, and basically said, you know, the Mediterranean's a very important strategic theatre. If you scratch our back, we'll scratch your back. We'll look after you. You can have your bases here. They never got a reply. But what became clear was that the Allies weren't going to take a strong position either way. So the mafia used a strategy of separatism to up the pressure on the local political actors and used that to force dealing with Rome. And Rome dealt them back into the game. Rome reached an accommodation with them. And we actually have the details of the negotiations that were carried out by military commanders sent by Rome, which baked the mafia back into the political settlement in Sicily with the terrible results over the intervening 60, 70 years that we all know about today. Now, there were a few wildcard armed groups, as there always are in these situations, and one of them was this handsome fellow, Salvatore Guiliano, who was one of the earliest masterers of the importance of a good media strategy. This is his photo from an interview he did with Life magazine in the hills above Palermo. And he was what in the literature is called a social bandit, someone that was understood by the local community as a Robin Hood figure, representing their grievances. But what he never managed to do was develop an effective political strategy. And in fact, he began to flail around, ultimately massacring about 73 women and children on May Day in the early 1940s, and that was the beginning of the end for him, for his legitimacy. But the importance of figures like this is that he begins to point us to a really important policy insight, that these actors, if they have political and social power, it's because they're cultivating legitimacy. And as I'll come to later in a few minutes, if we want to respond effectively to these actors, we have to treat them not just as criminal actors requiring a law enforcement response, but as the political and social actors that they are, requiring a political and social strategy. We have to undermine their legitimacy, and we even need a media strategy. If they've got a media strategy, we're going to need a media strategy to counter them. And that's not something we focused on. So here we are in the early post-war period, and the mafia have baked themselves successfully into the political settlement. And what happened in Palermo was what has now come to be known as the sack of Palermo. They basically baked themselves into the Christian Democratic hold over Palermo and began siphoning private rents off the public procurement processes. And that gave everybody an incentive to demolish historic Palermo and build huge new housing commissions, concrete over the wonderful gardens of Palermo. In the 60s, Palermo had the highest per capita consumption of concrete in the entire entire world. And this was basically because of these misaligned public and private incentives that came from this alliance. And what you end up seeing is that the capabilities of the state and of the criminal organisation are actually vertically integrated. The capabilities of the criminal organisation are used to govern, and the capabilities of the government are used to reap criminal rents. And that's what I describe in the book as a merger or joint venture strategy. It wasn't the first place that this had happened. It had also happened in Cuba. In 1933, so winding back now, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano sat in a room, room 39A of the Waldorf Astoria Towers in New York, and pulled all their their gangster bosses together and said, we're going into Cuba. Prohibition's done, we need new markets, we're going into Cuba. If you want in, the ante is $500,000, and then you will be allocated equity, or what in the mafia is called points. You'll be allocated points in different casinos and hotels and prostitution rings and cocaine trafficking. And that's what they did. They found this guy, Fulgencio Batista. He led a coup in Cuba. And then over the next 20 years, they formed a joint venture with Batista that merged over time. There were ups and downs, but over time they merged the capabilities of the state with their own criminal capabilities. To the point that they actually had a national development bank which was designed to underpin a tourism economy based on hotels, casinos, and vice markets, all controlled and operated by the New York and Havana mobs. The problem with this was that over time it really undermined the legitimacy of Batista. Back to, remember Dewey, end of the Second World War? He's confronted with the fact that Luciano has been a good ally to the US Navy, and basically told by the powers that be, that guy that you put away 10 years ago, Lucky Luciano, who you've got sitting in prison, you have to release him. So Dewey figures out a way to protect his own political capital, and what he does is he releases Luciano, but expels him from the US. Luciano had never been naturalized, it turned out, so they were able to expel him. They sent him to Italy. Great idea. Within 3 months, he shows up in Havana, on the doorstep of the United States, 90 miles from Florida, and he's basically signaling to his mafiosi counterparts, I'm back, I'm in charge, I can't come back to the United States, this is the new capital of our criminal empire, we're going to run things from Cuba. When you see people like him doing business with your rulers, the legitimacy of a ruling regime starts to diminish pretty quickly. But it wasn't only the legitimacy, it turned out it was the military effectiveness of the Cuban armed forces as well. Because the vertical integration was so complete that allocations of command posts were no longer based on assessments of military merit. They were based on bribery and patronage, because you wanted to go to a particular town because they had a particular brothel or a particular gambling market that you wanted to control. And we know from the archives that even the placement of troops was controlled not by the threat from Castro, but by criminal considerations. Now, Castro himself has an interesting background. During the period that Batista was in control, there was a period of political maneuvering that the Cubans call, interestingly, gangsterismo. And there is a cable from the US Embassy in Havana that points out a young student activist at the University of Havana who has the makings of a powerful new gangsterismo. His name is Fidel Castro. So he came up through a system where these things were intertwined, and he understood how to operate in this system and the combination of corruption and coercion that was needed to control this system. But when he came pushing from the east, there was no military effectiveness in the Cuban army, and it crumbled in front of him, and he walked pretty much into Havana. So what did the mafia do? The mafia first tried to bribe him and to make a deal. That didn't work, and they were pretty much expelled. And they decided 90 miles from Cuba wasn't a bad place to set up. So they set up in Miami, and And they took their Havana mob friends with them, and instead of owning hotels in Havana, they bought into the hotels in Miami. And from there, they began organizing terrorist attacks on Cuba. And we know now from the archival research that it was not the CIA that first initiated these attacks, it was the mafia. They flew planes out of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and they began bombing, in particular, US commercial interests in Cuba to try to foment civil unrest in Cuba to depose Castro. The traditional story is that it was the CIA that induced them to move from that fourth strategy of terrorism as a criminal strategy to a strategic alliance. But in fact, what we find from the archival research detailed in the book is that it was the other way around. It was the tail that wagged the dog. There are internal reports, now public, but again not reported for some reason, from a CIA Inspector General showing that it was the mob that brought the idea of collaboration to the CIA, not the other way around, which is not the normal theoretical story. The normal story is states are political actors and maybe occasionally they use criminal actors. We don't think of criminal actors as having international strategies, international political strategies in this way. So, the mob likes to live the high life, so they met at this little hotel in Miami called the Fontainebleau. And they met with, this was the guy they sent along. In the CIA records, he's called Sam Gold. We now know that he was actually Sam Giancana. He was the capi di tutti capi of the Chicago Mafia. And he met with several CIA, quite senior CIA operatives. And at his request, they gave him botulinum pills to pass to contacts in Havana to poison Fidel Castro. And it reads like something out of a Maxwell Smart plot. I mean, the schemes just become more and more harebrained. But what we learn is that it was the mob that was wagging the tail of the CIA, to the extent that they even set up governments in exile with people from the Havana mob, like this, again, very trustworthy looking gentleman, Antonio Verona, and pushed them as governments, alternative governments for Cuba. They hired a lobby firm on K Street. We know the exact one. We know why they hired them, because the head of the agency was sleeping with his secretary, who was the sister-in-law of a figure in the mob. So we have all these details now about how they got their access and how they exercised it strategically. What we also have come to understand, though, is that at the most senior levels, this was causing quite a lot of heartburn and heartache. This gentleman, Robert Kennedy, was the staff attorney on the Senate committee that examined the relationship between organised labour unions and the mob in the late 1950s. And he wrote a whole book. He literally wrote the book on that relationship called The Enemy Within. And he talks in that book about how if you're going to organise an assassination as a mob boss, you do it by what he describes as plausible deniability. So what we begin to see in this whole period is that the CIA and intelligence services approach to assassination of Castro not only involved the mafia, but had methods and methodologies that are very, very similar to the way that mob hits and assassinations are carried out. And now there's no suggestion here necessarily that he learned from the mob, although that's possible. The point is that when you're involved in subversive activities as a state, you're actually operating in a space and in a way that's extremely consonant with and similar to the way that criminal groups operate. After JFK's death, Lyndon Johnson found out about the relationship between the CIA and the mob, and his response was very simple. Recalling the hit squad that the mafia had set up in New York 20, 30 years before, he said simply, "We've been operating a murder in the Caribbean." And what the government learned through this was that it was extremely dangerous to do so. That when you seek to form a principal-agent relationship with criminal actors, if they have their own strategic orientation and goals, there's every danger that they will continue to pursue their strategic goals, not yours. And they learned this the hard way. including, the archival research shows, by injecting the mafia as a wild card into extremely high stakes situations. We now have evidence, turned up during my research, that the failure of the mob to assassinate Castro, as the CIA expected him, may be the missing piece from the Bay of Pigs crisis. It's pretty clear that a lot of things went wrong in the planning for the Bay of Pigs. But it's never really been understood why it was that the planners thought that the military operation would work in the first place, and what the political shock it was supposed to follow was. It may be that it was the expected assassination of Castro that was the political shock that the military invasion was supposed to come hard on the heels of. The failure to carry out that assassination explains the collapse of the plan more comprehensively. Equally, the mob was messing around with its own designs during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It turns out that in those famous 3 days in October, when the Soviets and the Kennedys were communicating through back channels to try to prevent nuclear war, the CIA and the mob, one of their commando squads that they'd stood up, went in to Cuba to try to carry out an assassination of Castro as the negotiations were going on. Luckily, the Kennedys got wind of it and countermanded the order. But this was what really drove home to the administration the danger of this form of strategic alliance. So that's the fifth strategy. What's the final sixth strategy? Because we're almost up to time. Well, what do you do when you can't force your way back into Cuba? You have to go looking for new markets. In the business management literature, there's a theory about this. It's called blue ocean strategy. The idea is that when you are operating in an ocean that is too crowded and it's running red with blood from the competition in the market, the best strategy is to look off to the horizon, find a nice blue ocean that's clear of rivals, and sail to that part of the market. That can mean several things. It can mean creating a new product that creates a new market. It can mean regulatory capture, although that's not formally touched on by the formal business management literature. In the mob's case, it meant moving. And first, it meant moving elsewhere in the Caribbean. They tried several times. They tried to mount a military invasion of Haiti, which failed. They tried to do business in the Dominican Republic, which failed. So eventually they settled on a nice little spot also close to Florida called the Bahamas. And what they did there was they got the support of the ruling white elite to build what is described in the documents of the time as a feudal domain on what is now Grand Bahama, which essentially became a free trade zone and became the testing ground for what we now know as casino capitalism. This is the Lucayan Beach Hotel from the time, which Meyer Lansky and his cohorts built in collaboration with the ruling elite and turned into the petri dish for offshore banking that has now spread throughout the Caribbean and around the world. Interestingly though, the same thing happened in Cuba. The locals got restless and they could see that they were being rorted, and they began to push for political change. But in the Bahamas in the 60s, this was racially tinted because it was a white elite that ruled. They even brought in South African and Rhodesian advisors to develop a campaign for keeping the locals down, so to speak. But the mafia had learned, and this is perhaps the best evidence we have that criminal actors can be strategic. They had learned from their experience in Cuba and they decided to do things differently. So they reached out to the emerging leader of the opposition, Sir Lyndon Johnson. They financed his election campaign. They gave him access to aircraft to get around to the small islands of the Bahamas, where it was hard for him to reach. They went into business with him. You might think that the Bahamas is a strange place to grow blueberries. If you think that, I'd tell you then you're clearly not a mafioso at heart. It's a great place to launder money, and blueberries are as good a business to launder money through as any other. So what we see here is a quite deliberate blue ocean strategy from the mafia, moving to a new market, in fact making a new market, and making it not just through business activity, but through political activity. So what do we learn from all this, from all these stories? Well, I think we learn several things. We learn that in some cases criminal groups do have political strategies and that they can take a wide array of methodologies and forms. It can lead to influencing elections. It can lead to stoking insurgencies and terrorism, to pushing for the separation of an island from its state and the formation of a new state. It can lead to making war when necessary, and it can lead to making peace when necessary. It's all very context specific. It also points, though, to the importance of legitimacy in understanding why these groups have the power that they develop, and in thinking about how to respond to them. And it points to the possibility that in more contemporary circumstances we might see groups combining different forms of legitimacy. Political, criminal, religious, even. In Mexico, that's what we see now. There's a group in Mexico called the Knights Templar. They're descended from another criminal organization called La Familia. And as the imagery suggests, they specifically set out to combine military forms of organization with religious legitimacy as the source of their governmental power, as the source of their codes and constitutions and norms. In West Africa, we see examples of armed groups not hybridizing forms of governmentality like this, but switching frequently between them. This guy, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, used to be known as Mr. Marlborough. In North Africa, there are very heavy government taxes on cigarettes. In southern West Africa, so to speak, literal West Africa, there are very different taxes on cigarettes. So if you can traffic cigarettes between those places across the Sahara, you stand to make massive profits. He was a key player in doing that. But as the image suggests, these days he's interested in something rather different. He represents what he does in a framework of Islamist jihadism, rather than through a criminal framework. What we see is armed groups switching between these different strategies depending on how they think it's going to yield them power and profit and serve their local designs. But I think the most troubling thought, to wrap up, is the thought actually offered by Mr. Woolsey in that comment to the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives, that it may not only be non-state armed actors that are combining political, criminal and business strategies, but increasingly state actors that are doing so. And the implications of that for the world that we live in, I think, are very profound indeed. Thank you.